Is divorce court presided over by Judge William Keene. In the case we'll be seeing today, Martin Hubbard is suing Mandy Hubbard, his wife of 3 years, for divorce on the grounds of adultery and mental cruelty. Mrs. Hubbard is countersuing on grounds of mental cruelty.
All right, Hubbard versus Hubbard. Mr. Beals, are you going to make an opening statement in this case?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. My client, Martin Hubbard, lived with his wife for 12 years before they became married. And after the marriage, Mrs. Hubbard became insanely jealous and pathologically possessive. She harassed my client at his job. She poisoned the mind of his supervisor against him. She seduced his best friend and committed acts that so traumatized my client that he was hospitalized for 1 month. My client seeks divorce on the grounds of adultery and mental cruelty and asks that he be allowed to retain the financial assets that he worked so hard to earn.
Mr. Passman, do you want to reserve your opening statement, or do you want to make it now?
Make it now, Your Honor. Thank you very much. Your Honor, the evidence will show that this is a 15-year relationship. 12 years where the parties lived together as if married, 3 years where they were actually married. There's substantial assets in this affair, Your Honor, and I suggest that my client would be entitled to 50% of the value of that. The reason for that, Your Honor, is very simply, from the day they got married, Mr. Hubbard did everything he possibly could to destroy the marriage. He attempted to induce my client into entering into extramarital relationships. He asked her to go to sex clubs, to perform sordid acts. He conspired with his best friend to set Mrs. Hubbard up so that he could then have justification for doing what he was doing. He became addicted to cocaine and blew what was probably a very promising career. Please, Your Honor, consider this when you grant the divorce to my client on the grounds of mental cruelty. Thank you.
Your first witness, please, Mr. Beals.
Thank you, Your Honor. I call Martin Hubbard to the stand.
Mr. Hubbard, step forward.
Now taking the stand is the plaintiff, Martin Hubbard, who is suing for divorce on grounds of adultery and mental cruelty. He alleges that his wife's treatment of him was the reason for a mental breakdown that resulted in hospitalization.
All right, Mr. Beals, let's proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Hubbard, what were the early days of your relationship like?
Well, we made Columbus look like a stay-at-home stick in the mud. We had passports and a packed suitcase by the front door. Traveling is really the acid test. If you can get along then you can really get along. Our relationship was the envy of all of our friends. It amazed us sometimes.
What happened to change your relationship?
We got married. Mandy wanted to have kids, and she didn't want any legal hassles. So we went to Tahiti and got married at sunrise, both dressed in sarongs. As soon as we got back to the States, that's when the trouble started.
What kind of trouble?
I found myself being accused of infidelity with every female who passed by. I couldn't believe some of the ugly scenes. I had to change banks 4 times. Our interest rates aren't so great, but all the tellers are over 60.
Did you try to get an explanation from her?
At first, yes. And she'd admit that she overreacted. And she'd apologize, but always after the fact. Then I made the mistake of telling her that I had a young new secretary, and that's when the phone calls started at work.
Did she call frequently?
12 times a day or more. I'm a commodities broker. My job requires total concentration on the board. 2 minutes away could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. I couldn't talk to her every time she wanted to.
Now, did all of this affect your work performance?
Terribly. And it got even worse when she started coming to the office. She deliberately tipped a cup of coffee into a computer. 125 brokers were staring at a blank commodities board. After a few weeks of this kind of behavior and not knowing what she was going to do, I was taking tranquilizers and seeing a psychiatrist.
Now, what occurred on a business trip that you took with your employer last March?
I packed a briefcase with the documents and the information we'd need. When I opened the case at the conference table in front of all the managers, the papers were still there, but there were also vibrators, marital aids, and I opened it in front of everybody.
How did this affect you?
Well, I excused myself. I don't think everyone saw in the case, and I went to the men's room, and I started to shake uncontrollably. My boss came and got me. Somehow I managed to finish the meeting.
Is it out of this incident that you have decided to file for divorce?
No. The final straw was when I got home that evening. All my clothes were piled on the front lawn, methodically ripped into shreds with a razor blade. $800 suits, silk ties, everything. It was so thorough and so sick. Anyway, the following Monday, I was asked to resign from work. 2 days later, I went into the hospital.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination, Mr.
Thank you, Your
Passman.
Honor. Mr. Hubbard, isn't it a fact, sir, your company recently settled 2 sexual harassment suits against you?
Yes, but that was the result of a complete misunderstanding. I was only joking with 2 women who obviously had no sense of humor.
Did you ever patronize an establishment known as the Golden Garter?
Yes, I went there for a friend's bachelor party.
And didn't you have to be forcibly objected when you started taking off your clothes and got up on stage with the performers?
I wasn't doing or saying anything different from the rest of the guys I was with.
Mr. Hubbard, just after your relationship, after your marriage, weren't you involved in a scandal over cocaine use at an office Christmas party?
Yes, but so were 12 other brokers. Somebody locked the men's room door, and the stuff was distributed before I could get out of there, and it was never determined who supplied it.
Wasn't your sailboat impounded by the Coast Guard after running aground?
Yes, it was.
And didn't they find $8,000 worth of cocaine and 2 naked women aboard?
I lease it out as a tax shelter. The cocaine belonged to the guy who rented it. I was completely absolved of that.
Mr. Hubbard, soon after your marriage and your return from Tahiti, didn't you begin to encourage your wife to accept the concept of an open marriage and have extramarital relationships?
Mandy was getting so paranoid. Whenever I came near another woman, I was suggesting anything and everything I could.
Didn't you tell her if she had extramarital relationships, then she'd understand how insignificant your affairs were?
I never said anything of the sort.
Mr. Hubbard, consequently, as a result of your conduct, didn't you really push your wife into a relationship with your best friend, Reed Goodman?
When she ended up in bed with my best friend, she fell. I didn't have to push her.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Hubbard, you may step down. Mr. Beals, call your next witness, please.
While Mr. Hubbard
Thank you,
leaves
Your
the
Honor.
stand,
Plaintiff
we have
calls
time
Reed
for this
Goodman
short
to the
break.
stand.
We return now to divorce court. About to testify on behalf of Mr. Hubbard is Reed Goodman, who's been a friend of the Hubbards for 15 years.
Mr. Beals.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Goodman, how would you describe Mandy Hubbard's attitude toward you?
Provocative. I used to spend a lot of time with them down at their summer place. She'd always ask me to rub her back or her legs after a game of tennis, or when she'd take her clothes off to go skinny dipping in the lake, she'd make it look like it was a striptease.
Now, did you ever spend any time alone with her at that summer place?
Sure. All of it quite innocent. Until one day when Marty was on a business trip, she called, terribly depressed, and asked me if I'd come over. When I got over there, she was wearing a very loose silk kimono.
How did that
Nothing
make
else.
you feel? How did that make you feel? I'm sorry.
Apprehensive. We talked for a couple of hours, and we drank, and after 3 bottles of wine, I had a terrible headache. I asked her for an aspirin. She gave me a Quaalude.
What happened next?
She was all over me. She wanted to sleep with me so that she could understand her husband's desires for other women. She told me that she felt ugly and unattractive and that no man would ever want her again. Between the wine and the drugs and her pleading, I finally gave in.
Did you ever sleep with her again?
No. I felt really ashamed of what I'd done, and I told Marty, and he forgave me. But Mandy wouldn't let it drop. She kept alternating between bragging about it and insisting that it was some sort of a plot between Marty and me.
Thank you, sir. No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, Ms. Passman, cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Isn't it a fact, sir, that you supplied the Quaaludes to Mrs. Hubbard?
No.
And isn't it a fact, sir, that you repeatedly tried to get Mrs. Hubbard to sleep with you again, especially when your best friend, her husband, was in the hospital?
I called her a couple of times, yes, because she was really upset, and I just wanted to find out how she was.
Isn't it possible, sir, that because of your betrayal to your best friend, that's why you put him in the hospital?
Marty forgave me.
No further
It was her
questions, Your Honor.
fault.
All right, you may step down. Mr. Beals, your next witness, please.
No further witnesses, Your Honor. Plaintiff rests.
All right, call your first witness, Mr. Passman.
Thank you, Your Honor. We call Mandy Hubbard to the stand.
Step forward, Mrs. Hubbard.
Now taking the stand is the defendant, Mandy Hubbard, who is countersuing on grounds of mental cruelty. Mrs. Hubbard will obviously comment on her husband's charges that her attitudes toward him changed drastically as soon as they were married.
All right, let's proceed with this witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mrs. Hubbard, were you looking forward to your marriage with Martin?
Yes, of course. I always expected to marry him. We'd had a 12-year relationship as lovers, and it was wonderful. But then I got older. I wanted children, a good home, some solid values, and Marty. I couldn't see how anything could go wrong.
And did it?
Well, obviously so. Here we are. I don't know, something seemed to snap inside of him once we were married. He wanted to do things he never thought of before. For instance, one night we went to an artist loft for what I thought was an opening. Well, the place was covered with black lights and mirrors on the ceiling. Some guy asked me to join in on a threesome, and Marty suggested I go along with it. I couldn't believe it.
What did you do?
Not what they wanted, that's for sure. I walked out. I had to step over a drunk asleep in the doorway. I was just horrified. Marty followed eventually. I thought I was going to be sick. I was so disillusioned and confused. I mean, I couldn't understand how our marriage had gotten to this point.
Were there other times when Mr. Hubbard suggested to you that you have extramarital relations?
Yes, he wanted me to sleep with Reed. He said if I slept with Reed, I would understand how he could sleep with another woman without losing his love for me. I was so angry with Reed, a man we've known for years.
Did you load your husband's attaché case with erotic paraphernalia?
No, I'm afraid that was something he did for himself. He used to bring this stuff home to try out on me. He just picked up the wrong attaché case, excuse me. When I told him that, he suggested that I was a spy working subversively for another brokerage firm.
Did you see any particular reason for Mr. Hubbard's actions?
Yes, he was doing $800 worth of coke per week. I ignored it for too long, but it was obviously behind his erratic behavior and his dysfunctioning as a husband. We hadn't made love for months.
Mrs. Hubbard, I know this will be difficult for you, but could you please tell the court about your evening with Reed Goodman?
Marty and I were fighting, as usual, and he asked me to just talk to Reed. So Reed comes in, bottle of wine in one hand, and those pills. He was so persistent. Kept beating down my defenses and telling me, relax, relax. He knew I was feeling terrible about myself. Well, when I was done, I felt like much worse. Finally, Marty had what he wanted, and he still wasn't satisfied. He went into a frenzy. He called me a whore. I walked the streets. I'd do it with anybody or anything. When he was through with me, I was physically sick.
Thank you. No further questions.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mrs. Hubbard, forgetting the sheer allegations, did you actually ever see your husband in an affair with another woman?
No, it was obvious what he was up to. He used to lech after women passing in the streets.
Isn't it a fact that you caused a scene on the plane after your marriage, coming back to the United States from Tahiti?
He caused the scene. He and a stewardess locked themselves up in a restroom. The whole plane was laughing at me.
Now, isn't it a fact that your husband, in explaining that incident to you, told you that the stewardess had only locked the door temporarily to fix the lock.
Yes, add insult to injury. A stewardess's hair and makeup wouldn't have looked like hers from fixing a lock for a second.
Why did you begin calling your husband several times a day at his job?
I doubt if I called him twice a week for as long as he worked there.
Then why, pray tell, Mrs. Hubbard, is it that his secretary's logbook shows clearly that you called as many as 15 times a day?
I have no idea unless he put her up to it.
Did you have it in your mind to seduce Reed Goodman when you invited him over to your summer place?
No, I did not. Reed was like family.
Didn't you tell him that evening that you thought he was attractive?
Yes, I often compliment my friends.
Is it usual with your friends that you give them those sorts of blandishments when you're dressed in a skimpy, seductive gown?
It was a warm summer evening, and we were close friends. I often wear that robe.
With your close friends, I'm sure. Now tell me, did you take your robe off, or did Mr. Goodman?
I'm not sure. He had me so loaded, I just don't remember.
I see. Now, Mrs. Hubbard, why is it that you told your husband after this was all over, and I quote you, that you were glad that you slept with Reed Goodman because now you knew what it was like to sleep with a real man?
I was angry and hurt. Haven't you ever said anything because you were angry and wanted to hurt somebody back?
Yes, perhaps, Mrs. Hubbard, but I'll tell you, I'm not here to answer the questions. You are. Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, you may step down. Call your next witness,
While
please.
Mrs. Hubbard leaves the stand, we have time for a short break. We return now to divorce court. About to testify on Mrs. Hubbard's behalf is George Pryor, the vice president of a brokerage firm.
All right, Ms. Passman.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Pryor, how long has Mr. Hubbard worked for your firm?
8 years, first as a retail broker, and then we promoted him to senior account executive.
And when he was promoted to senior account executive, how did he handle it?
Oh, very badly, I'm afraid. He became tense and moody at work. It was reported to me that he was away from his desk at crucial times during the day.
Did you take any action?
Yes, once I followed him, and I saw him taking cocaine. Martin had been a good employee for many years. I wanted to help him. I suggested to him that he enter a voluntary drug program, which the firm would pay for.
And what was his response?
That he had no problem.
Mr. Pryor, Mr. Hubbard claims that the sexual harassment complaints leveled against him were mere accusations. How did the firm feel about that?
Well, I'm sorry to say that for the past 3 years or so, Mr. Hubbard has been quite a womanizer in the office. He comes on, I think the phrase is, with all the female members of our office staff. The two he approached reported that he was quite graphic in detailing the various sex acts that they would have to perform on or with him if they expected to receive any kind of promotion.
Thank you very much. No further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Beals.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Pryor, what was Mr. Hubbard's position in relationship to other employees in your firm when he was fired?
Oh, he was fourth.
Fourth of how many?
175 worldwide.
Now, sir, isn't it a fact that Mr. Hubbard brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of business into your firm during this period of time that, as you say, he was secretly positioning himself in the restroom snorting cocaine?
Yes.
Isn't it exceptional, to say the least, for someone to bring in that kind of business when he's debilitated by a substantial drug problem?
Yes, but you see, in an organization such as ours, there are standards of behavior that we
Yes,
must
I understand.
maintain.
Now, while Mr. Hubbard was bringing in this business to your firm, isn't it true that you were actually losing accounts?
Well, there's a certain amount of fluctuating that goes on, even within an individual
Just a simple
broker's
yes or
portfolio.
no would do, please, Mr. Pryor.
Yes.
I see. Now, when Mr. Hubbard was actually dismissed, isn't it a fact that you took over his most lucrative accounts?
They were distributed among several of our top brokers, and yes, I assume some of them.
Yes, I see. Now, isn't it also a fact, sir, that you stand to make over $1 million in the next 5 years from the accounts that you took over from my client, Mr. Hubbard?
Yes, but only because I got them away from him in time.
Yes, I understand. No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, you may step down. Anything further from the defendant?
Nothing, Your Honor. The defense rests. Thank
Mr.
you.
Beals, anything further from the plaintiff?
Plaintiff rests, Your Honor.
I'll hear closing argument.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, I think as the evidence has shown, my client, Mr. Hubbard, ended a 12-year lover's relationship only to be treated with scorn and suspicion from the first day of his marriage. Not only did the defendant, his estranged wife, harass him at his home, but she also harassed him at work. She carefully planned the seduction of his best friend, and she seriously maligned him in front of his peers. She maliciously destroyed his wardrobe, and as the evidence also has shown, her vindictive, unbalanced measures pressured my client into a mental hospital. His friendships, marriage, and career all destroyed. Your Honor, my client seeks divorce on the grounds of adultery and mental cruelty and asks that he be allowed to retain the substantial marital assets that he worked so hard to earn.
Mr. Passman, I'll hear from you now.
Thank you, Your Honor. I think the evidence has shown, Your Honor, that the only sin Mrs. Hubbard has been guilty of is that she cared too much for her husband. From day one of the marriage, Mr. Hubbard did everything he could to destroy the marriage. He wanted her to have an open marriage, sexual relations with all kinds of men, because he was having it with different women. He conspired with Reed Goodman, his very best friend, Your Honor, to induce Mrs. Hubbard into entering into a relationship with him, because then he could prey on her in this fashion. He introduced her to sex clubs where sordid and deviant conduct manifested. She didn't want to do this, Your Honor. It happened to her. She shouldn't be punished, Your Honor. The divorce should be granted to her on grounds of mental cruelty, and please find it to give her half of the assets over the 15-year relationship. Thank you very much.
Thank you, counsel.
While Judge Keene reviews the testimony, we have time for a break. We return now to divorce court. The bailiff has called the court to order, and Judge Keene is about to render his decision.
All right, the Hubbard union was an interesting one. 12 years of living together and 3 years of marriage. Mrs. Hubbard, I'm satisfied, went into this union with the full expectation of marriage. During the living together period, there was a full commingling of all income. There was a joint checking account, and these two parties held themselves out during this 12-year period of time for all to see as husband and wife. Then there was a confirmation of this understanding by the subsequent marriage. All of this, of course, goes to the configuration of the marital estate in this case. And it is clear to me that there must be a division of the marital estate, as I'm going to order a judgment of divorce in this case. The adultery Mr. Hubbard has alleged in his complaint has been proved by a preponderance of the evidence. So has the mental cruelty on both sides. This marriage is obviously now devoid of any legitimate objects of matrimony. A joint judgment of divorce is therefore ordered on the complaint and on the cross-complaint. Because of this 15-year union and the way it was constituted, 12 years living together, 3 years of marriage, I'm going to order that the marital assets of this case be evaluated on the basis of the 15-year union. And the assets in this case, which were at one time substantial, have now been depleted. The figure that I have in this case is $180,000 net, and the division of this case will be on the basis of a 60%, 40% division, with the 40% going to Mrs. Hubbard. I'll order spousal support for Mrs. Hubbard for 18 months, remarriage, or further order of this court of $1 a month. Mr. Hubbard is no longer employed. He may or may not have a cocaine problem. I'll order spousal support in this amount to retain jurisdiction in this case, and I'll change it should there be a change of circumstances. This court stands in recess.
Divorce court is a dramatization based on cases and issues raised in the family courts of this nation. The jurisdiction is an amalgamation of the laws of all 50 states. Therefore, the laws of your community may differ. The cases are argued by attorneys and presided over by Judge William Keene, who served on the Superior Court of Los Angeles for 18 years.